All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Redpoint Office Hours. We're thrilled to have Tomasz and Jim Benton, the CEO of Chorus AI, joining us this morning to talk about a incredibly timely and important topic of driving sales in the COVID era. And so we're thrilled to have everyone here. Let's kick us off. So I'm Travis Bryant. I lead our founder experience program at Redpoint. That's the series of programs and tools and people we have to support our community and our Redpoint portfolio companies. And I'll just do a brief overview of AirMeet before showing myself off stage so that we can get to the real good stuff. If this is your first time using the tool, please chat away. You can chat with your fellow attendees, or you can use the one-to-one chat. If you had a reaction to something that Tomasz or Jim had that was a particularly salient point, you can use those emojis at the bottom. You can see a couple people already taking advantage of those. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask Tomasz or Jim, please use the questions section. So chat is more general and global, but you can ask questions there and then others can vote on those. I'll be moderating those from backstage and then teeing those up for the team to talk about. And lastly, we will be providing a transcript of the key learnings from the session. So don't feel like you have to scribble notes. You can just sit back and enjoy. And we're looking forward to a great and spirited debate. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tomasz and take it away.
Thank you, Travis. Hi, everybody. My name is Tomasz Tunguz. I'm a managing director at Redpoint Ventures. Welcome to Redpoint Office Hours. We are so glad you're here. This is a program where we invite luminaries from the SaaS world and other domains to share insights. We've done them for about 4 years now. Started in a small room format. We were just reminiscing before. Travis had done one before he became our head of founder experience. And now we're doing them virtually, and we are thrilled to do it. It's been a huge success. Some of our recent guests include Holly Wegman, who's the former CMO at Segment and now an EIR at Redpoint, GC Lionetti, who's the CMO at Confluent, Allison Pickens 2 weeks ago, who was the CEO at Gainsight. Today, we've got more than 930 people registered, an absolutely massive event. Thank you so much for being here. We've gathered questions from the audience ahead of time, but as Travis said, please submit questions as we go. The more interactive, the better. We will spend 40 minutes in a fireside chat format, and we'll open up to questions from the audience. I do want to thank Travis, Ashley, and Grace, the team members behind the scenes who help us pull these fantastic events together. Now on to the show. Today, we welcome Jim Benton. Jim is no stranger to great salesmanship. He was acquired into Ticketmaster via Evite, turned around the largest region for them, became VP sales at AdBrite, grew that business to great scale. He founded ClearSlide, which was one of the iconic and original sales technology companies, became CEO at Apollo, and is now leading Chorus through record growth for the last 3 quarters. And for those of you that don't know, Chorus is a Redpoint company. It's a leading conversational intelligence platform that counts Zoom, Mongo, Bill.com, Adobe Qualtrics, and DocuSign, amongst many others as customers. Jim, thank you so much for being with us today. To kick things off, I have a surprise for you.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to share a secret with the audience that I haven't told you. You're the fastest walker I have ever met. I remember when you and I first were talking, we went for a stroll around San Francisco right along the bay. Do you remember?
I remember.
And I had a hard time keeping up with you and speaking at the same time. And it was an embarrassing moment for me because I'm an ex-New Yorker and I pride myself on my walking speed, but you are in a different league. And, you know,
you were miles away, I think, at the turnaround point.
we had gone farther than anybody else. And I said to myself, if Jim has this much energy for walking, imagine how much energy he'd bring to Chorus as the CEO. And so that was
I appreciate that.
But it's true. So your energy at the company is absolutely contagious. The entire company has responded. I've seen it as a board member. And in fact, your vibe reminds me of somebody else, Ted Lasso. For those of you who don't know, Ted Lasso is a TV show that just won a Golden Globe. It's about an American football coach who begins to train an English Premier League soccer team. And Natalie told me that this is required watching for the exec team at Chorus. Jim, tell us, why is it that you make your entire exec team watch Ted Lasso?
I stumbled on Ted Lasso, and by the way, thanks, Tomasz, for having me here. Such a pleasure to be with this group and for so many folks that are joining us now. Ted Lasso, introduced to it over the holidays, and right in the first week in January, I watched it, and it just was the right time, right? The year there's a lot going on in the first week in January as well. And it just was so inspiring. And I think that when you look at the leadership lessons and the people lessons that come from Ted Lasso, outside of it just being a funny show, it's one of the better leadership experiences I've seen. So we ran our offsite on it and everybody went through it. And even Fortune and Wall Street Journal have talked about some of the key lessons that came out of Ted Lasso. So I recommend Googling it. They're awesome lessons to live by.
That's fantastic. That's awesome. Yeah, we love the show. My wife and I watched it, and I think there's the thing that ties you and him together is your relentlessly positive and optimistic attitude. It's awesome.
Trying to have fun too. I think that in the beginning of January, how do you just shake up the meetings a little bit? And I think the ceremonies in Ted Lasso, the way they make small events very significant. And for those that have seen Ted Lasso, think about the question box. It could be generic, but it wasn't. It was over the top. Think about the whistle, things that could have been simple. They made a big deal out of it. And with all of us at home and all of us in COVID, how do we make a big deal out of the little things to just make it more fun to work together?
Yeah. Well, one of the things actually he does in the show that you do very effectively is aligning a team, right? He comes into a team that's sort of fractured and isn't playing very well together. And you talk about this a lot in board meetings. It's alignment, which is harder in COVID. But would you mind talking and sharing with the audience a little bit about how you think as a CEO, how do I align my team?
Yeah, it became a passion project. Being a founder at ClearSlide and going through that experience, which had its epic days and moments, I also saw as we went through massive scale how important it is to get everybody aligned, not just in departments, but truly working well together. And as I transitioned out of ClearSlide, I'd look at teams like Apple, where you have leaders on stage that have worked there for 20 plus years. Yeah. And they're comfortable. And you look at LinkedIn, where leaders are on stage that have been there for so long, they work well together. They seem to have deep trust. And I just got fixated on my next company, this is back in 2015, will be the most aligned business. And it did set me on a pretty big journey of thinking about what mattered and what I wanted out of the second half of my career. And just thinking about the people and how important it is that, what if we could build an iconic team? What if we could build a team that everyone talked about? And what would it take to do that? And so the alignment rhythm has been my way of doing that, which is getting the entire company centered around a mission, a set of, bold objectives and key results, OKRs, aligned on core values, and then aligned on the metrics. And we fit it all to one page. We run it quarterly. We run our all hands on it. We run our board meeting on it. We run our leadership meeting. It is deeply ingrained in the business. And it's essentially the Jim Collins built to last. It's the John Doerr OKRs, and it's the Bill Walsh, the score will take care of itself, which is why the metrics are at the bottom and not the top of the way we run the business. But it also means rooting out areas of where we're not aligned. I think the key to alignment is communication. It's not really the results. It's, can we just talk about what good looks like and where we're going and align on these key pillars? And if we're all agreed to do that, we're going to do just fine. Or we're going to work through the challenges that come up every day. But at least we won't have to have tension. We'll just plow through them.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, and I've definitely done this, is when you do have tension within the workplace, it's easy to sort of shy away from it and not have the courage to dig into it. But it sounds like actually having that conversation is a key part of alignment. How do you identify when there's friction, and then how would you advise those in the audience to manage those situations?
I think you'll start to see when you have friction because it becomes a hub and spoke, right? You've been in those areas where you're getting feedback, but it's not shared in the team. And rooting that out and surfacing that quickly, I think, is so important. So figuring out where there's frictions. This is the Ted Lasso moment. He had two key players that were rock stars, but they did not sync. And he found the moments to connect them, to build that trust. It comes down to trust. How do you build trust? For me, I joined Chorus March 16th, so I didn't get a chance to see the team and be with the team. Still haven't been to our office yet we've had an incredible growth. So how do I get the team together? I started inviting the leadership team to my backyard in the fall, and we do fire pits and pizza, optional with masks on and comfortable. But we got to know each other. We got to talk. We got to be outside of agendas, and those built the connections, which were super powerful.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, transitioning a little bit, you've been with the company for almost a year now through entirely COVID, and because of where Chorus operates, we record and analyze millions of conversations, and that gives you a unique lens. In fact, we released a state of conversation intelligence report, and we analyzed 35 million calls to understand what's going on. I'll put it in the chat for people to look at. But given all that data, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen teams go through during the COVID? What changed and was a challenge for some of the sales teams that you monitor?
When I had joined March 16th, COVID was just getting into the full swing. And one of the observations that we had was that we had access to the data. We had access to understand what was happening in these conversations. And as we started to mine that, Tomasz, as you mentioned, the 35 million calls, even in the first weeks that I joined, we were watching the COVID mentions, or COVID showing up in the conversations. And it went from 8% of the conversations had COVID to the next week, 23%, to the next week, 63%. And on March 16th, 98% of all sales calls had the word COVID in it. So we were like, whoa, it's there. And that's what set us on a journey to how do we free this data in a way that people can make big decisions? And so as we looked at it, the biggest trends that we saw, both in the early part of COVID and still sticking around, is significantly more involvement of leadership, both on the sales side as well as the buying side. So we're seeing a 42% increase in sellers bringing their leaders in. We're seeing almost double the amount of C-level execs or VP and above joining on the buyer side. So when we're selling to customers, they're bringing in top leadership. And we know our data shows that when leadership gets involved, you have a 34% higher close rate. So these are actually really interesting positive signals. Because we're on Zoom, because people are more accessible, they're joining and participating. Meetings to now taking 4.6 meetings to close a deal. And before, when we lost deals, we would have 2.8. Now it's taking 4.1. And so we need to make sure that we're picking the right deals to work on, because they're just more Zooms. It's easier to get people involved, and it's taking more time to work through those.
Wow, that's fascinating that you need at least one more marginal meeting, maybe two, to close a deal. And you need to bring in an exec or a higher up in order to close it. Why do you think, is it about building trust, going back to the point that you were making before? Is it building trust in the process, or is it more about like budgeting, or do you have a sense of what's driving that?
Yeah, I think in the beginning of the period where it was remote, execs were getting involved to really identify what were mission critical, business essential purchases they had to make. So we found that 92% increase in CFOs joining calls. That's significant. And as they got involved, we were finding that they were trying to size up what was really mission critical. And so extreme ROI became the theme in Q2 of last year. Is how do you just make sure that you're speaking CFO language and not just line of business language, because the line of business deals weren't getting done. It really was having to go to the next level.
Yeah. And you host a show where you talk to lots of different sales leaders. I'm curious, with that increase in the volume and meetings in order to close, were they talking about things like employee fatigue or burnout from kind of additional stress that was coming? Is that something that you've seen?
They were. We were looking at burnout. There was different signals we'd pick up. We would pick up even RIFs early on. We were curious if people that are buying are talking about layoffs or RIFs or not hiring. We saw 130% increase. We were seeing signals that the market was going to tighten and it's going to be more challenging to get deals done. We saw different segments start to really behave differently, where certain markets were, down. Travel was down 29% in terms of the meetings they were having. HR was down 33%. Burnout is what we started to track as the next step, which is, okay, our sales teams are working remotely. They're in their bedrooms and garages and et cetera, yet they're still connecting at similar levels of meetings that they had pre-COVID, which was really amazing and just an awesome feat of the industry. But we saw a 20% increase in burnout mentions just in the calls. And that really became the topic of all the CROs that I interviewed and leaders during the time, was just how do we keep our teams together and healthy and, keeping it fun.
Yeah, for sure. That's been a topic in almost every single board call. And we haven't found any solutions. It just seems like changing things up and having different kinds of events and getting people engaged seems to be what people are trying, at least.
We saw that the empathy is interesting. We noticed that demos started 2 minutes later last year than it did in previous periods.
Wow.
The calls were, instead of a demo starting in the 8th or 9th minute, it was the 11th or 12th minute. And we were finding that people were just connecting more authentically. And this is the part that I'm excited about. I hope this continues post-COVID. I do think we saw some of the finest sales motions in a decade. People became very real. They were connecting. You could see people's backgrounds. They were talking about their lives more. And that was showing up in the data. So demos were shorter, later, and people were engaging in a different way.
That's awesome. I'm curious, as we shifted to this selling remotely, were there new metrics that sales leaders have adopted, or new ways of measuring their teams?
So Tomasz, I asked one of our sales leaders about, what is it like, managing during COVID? And
yeah,
the weekend he shared, he goes, in addition to coaching and the performance, becoming the psychologist of the team was really the fourth area that he mentioned, of just around finding a way to bring the team together, to connect, to be human. Really, I think has been the key piece to making sure that we keep the mental health high. What all the data has shown is that productivity is not an issue. Our teams are wildly productive right now. You can see it across SaaS and the growth of the businesses. But the way we're working is very different. We noticed that we're having far more meetings before 9 a.m., far more meetings after 4 p.m. This is all showing up in the data across the entire platform. So how do we keep our team healthy? And how do we have games? How do we have different huddles and ways to bring them together? So that's been, I think, the biggest area. And then the little coaching on that. As we start to get into the connection, we find that on the team side, what he shares, just understanding their body language. Like when you watch the interactions and see how they present and the experience they're creating for the buyers, what is their body language and what's the buyer's body language? And how do we just start to coach more specifically on what we're picking up in that overall signal?
Awesome. Got a question from the audience. Paul asks, with more VPs and C-suite members from the buyers joining sales call, what's the optimized configuration on the selling side? Does having the frontline sales manager in the call make a difference in close rates?
It does. If you don't have a frontline manager and you're different than what we're seeing in the data, people are bringing more people on their team into the meetings, not just the execs, but even their frontline managers. And as these sellers are bringing a wider audience, it's nice to match. So if you're going to have the buyer plus their executive team, it's great to have a frontline manager on that call and involved in that. And we find that with people not traveling on Mondays, Monday meetings have spiked in terms of the accessibility of leaders being able to join those. But I think the biggest data that we've seen, Paul, is that more people are joining the meetings. It is not just a one-to-one ratio that we saw before.
Interesting. Cool. Okay, so you talked a little bit before that question about how the demo has shifted. Later people are talking more, and sort of building rapport. Are there any other major changes that you've seen in meetings? Like, are people using different words, or is there sort of different dynamics in the meeting? Like, does pricing come up sooner rather than later? I mean, I'll just give you a sense. I was talking to a founder. We run a venture firm, and there's also a funnel. We were talking to founders who are managing different fundraising processes, and I was like, hey, what is it like fundraising on Zoom? And they said, well, it's way more transactional at the beginning, because instead of doing 3 different meetings on Sand Hill Road, I can schedule 12 different 30-minute calls with VCs at the beginning. And I'm curious, like, is that something that you see, like way more transactional meetings up front?
I think so. I mean, that's one of the benefits, is you can say we have more opportunity. We can connect with more people. We're traveling less, given that nobody can travel. So there's just greater access to people. And what we're finding, I think in the data that we see, one of the interesting data points is storytelling. As we look at that data, we found that the top performers are telling 20% more stories. And I think during this time, that really resonates. It's harder to connect when you're just on video. So we know stories work, and we know that they're including social proof 68% of the time more, which is referencing real stories about a specific buyer by logo in their stories. And that's working. That's driving higher close rates. That's helping them to connect and also deliver on that extreme ROI trend that we've seen. We also saw that payment terms were changing. We saw a huge shift in net 30 language being pushed out. It got pushed out over 50% to longer terms. It's now settled back down, but just knowing that was an industry-wide trend enabled people to think more thoughtfully about how do you build the right incentives to potentially achieve a net 30 during that Q2, Q3 time period.
That's fascinating. It's interesting that you touch on social proof. There's that classic book, Dale Carnegie, How to Make Friends and Influence People. And one of his major tenets is social proof, right? It's showing others that they're involved.
Out there is a new way to engage. It was difficult to make BDR calls. The data was showing that dials and connects were down. So how do we get people? We saw the spike go up and then it tapered off. We're still higher in terms of webinar talk than we were pre-COVID. But those are some of the interesting trends, which is what do you do with this data? How do you act on it? How do you create the right experiences?
That's interesting. So at the beginning of COVID, just to summarize, dials and connects were down. So SDRs and BDRs had a really hard time getting in. But people were really wanting to talk more about webinars. Sales cycles lengthened. The terms for payment lengthened. And now have you seen sort of a reversion to what it was pre-COVID, or are we still sort of in a different state?
Yeah, we publish all this data on our website. It's called the State of Conversation Intelligence. So people can look at this, and we've updated it month by month. Some of the data has started to settle down. You could see it calm down in Q3, Q4. Those are trends such as we had a lot of unannounced execs joining calls in late Q2. So typically when a CXO is invited to a call, they're invited on the calendar invite. We saw a change where they were showing up in a lot of the meetings, but they were not invited to the calendar invite. So that means the buyer says, hey, why don't you join this call? I'll just. And so I think that unprompted, we saw 3 CEOs in SMB companies were showing up in calls 3 times more than pre-COVID. And what we're finding now kind of post is that those levels are settling down a bit more. The CEOs are not as involved as they were during that crisis zone. And the CXOs who are unannounced are starting to be more announced. They're on the invites again. It's, those areas are settling down. But on the number of meetings, it's held. Even up until December, we're still seeing a significant increase in the number of meetings it's taking to win a deal or to get to the point of going to close lost.
Got it. Awesome. And so now that we're sort of entering that transition phase, we've got, we will have enough vaccines so everybody by May.
Yep.
Elad Gil just published this great post on what it means to return to work. We've been talking about returning to the office at the board. How do you see this transition from, on where we are today to where we will be in the future? How much of this, is it going to go back to normal? What do you think it's going to look like?
It's really interesting. I think we're all trying to figure that out. I'm sure everybody on here right now has different opinions and we're reading different pieces. What's been really encouraging, which I hope does not go away, is the way that we're coaching our teams right now is fundamentally different. We're onboarding people in a way that they're able to understand what their peers do because we're recording all these interactions. We didn't do that before. And suddenly, if you want to see how a deal that was won in a certain vertical, what was the talk track to get there? The brand new hire that just joined can find those key moments and ramp up in a way that we have not seen a crew ramp that fast. We see it on our side that our new hires are achieving goals in first and second months, which we didn't do that before. So I think on the positive, the way that we're onboarding and the precision of coaching, down to the time-stamped second of here's what I liked or here's what I didn't like, that part we expect to stay and will be a tremendous uplift to the industry. What's missing is the human interaction. And I think there's a lot of debate on this right now. Hey, can we all go remote first? And what we're doing right now works. I personally believe we do want to get back together, and we'll be flexible, but we're building around hubs. We're not going remote. So we have offices in Tel Aviv, Toronto, Boston, San Francisco. Now we're opening up Salt Lake City. We want people to be able to drive and come together several days a week. We'll see what that turns out to be. And what we hear is that for especially folks that we're developing, being around other talent, being able to get a coffee, being able to go for a walk, being able to collaborate is important. And I look at our kids, and Tomasz, I know you have kids too. I would never say to the kids, you don't need to go back to school. You're fine on Zoom at home. You're learning, it's great, and you have all the access. They need to be with their friends. I don't know why we don't need to be with our coworkers. And personally, I find it a ton of fun to laugh and all the banter with people. And I kid with people that if I'm going to spend the next 20 years of my life in my room here and then retire, that sounds miserable. So I want to be with people, and there's a lot of different ways we can do that. And that's what we're trying to figure out is what is the role of the office? I think it'll be more than just a command center, more than just a clubhouse. I think we are going to want desks and people to come back. But I don't think the one area that I think will change fundamentally, I don't see us hooking up to TVs and Logitech cams in the conference room and Zoom going back to remote people being second-class citizens on the screen. I would expect we're all going to be on laptops looking at people front and center with eye contact and using centralized audio, HomePods, et cetera, things that we're testing. But I don't see us going back to a room untethered. And we also expect that all in-person meetings going forward post-COVID, they will have Zoom or Teams or WebEx in it because someone's not going to be in the room. Someone that you flew to go meet is going to have a colleague that's remote, or you're going to have a sales engineer. So we're going to be in every interaction going forward, and everybody should get ready for this massive data stream that's going to transform go-to-market. We have access to now know what works. That's awesome.
That's fascinating. So your take is that every meeting will be hybrid. That's just the way it's going to be.
That, and you're going to find that you're going to want to present in Zoom versus firing up Google Slides or PowerPoint. Zoom has their new app store coming out. We're going to be launching our new Zoom app with real-time intelligence. It's going to have collaborative note-taking. So if you have 5 people on a call, now you have one single notebook that goes straight to Salesforce. There'll be many other Zoom apps that we're all going to fall in love with that are going to make us say, look, this is how we present. And most likely, we don't want to be thrown off when someone says, hey, Joe or Mary couldn't join today. What's the dial-in? Yeah. And that's why I think that we're going to be recording everything going forward. And everyone will be very comfortable with this. There's nothing new about this. It'll feel awkward to not be in this environment, in my opinion.
Awesome. That's great. Okay, we got a bunch of questions here. Anila asks, have we finally broken the requirement for in-person sales meetings? Is the trend here to stay since it's more efficient for everybody to be virtual?
Here's what I would say on that. Once you hear that your competition showed up at someone's headquarters, just took your client on a large deal out to lunch, met the team, walked the halls, I think we're all going to feel slightly flat-footed sitting in our bedrooms and our dining rooms and whatever rooms we work in. It doesn't mean that we're going straight back, in my opinion, to jumping on the plane to do a Google slide deck for everybody. But the role of building trust and the role of building deeper relationships, there'll be a huge need for in-person. I expect it to be more experiential, less of sitting in someone's conference room and more meals and concerts and seeing them at conferences, but finding ways to have fun with people, because I think everyone's hungry to do more together that's not on Zoom.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, question from Paul. Going back to the question of bringing in sales managers into the sales process, do bringing in sales managers make more of a difference at the top of the funnel for qualification or bottom of the funnel for close?
In my opinion, it would definitely. I don't have a data point to throw out to you, Paul, on that. But from just my personal experience on that, it would be more on the close side. We need to train our teams to be able to capture a large top of the funnel without our leadership, in my opinion, on it. When I co-founded ClearSlide, I remember hiring our first 2 reps, and my message to them when we were all sitting in a room, this back in 2010, was, I'm not going to close any of your deals. You're going to start the call, you're going to demo, and you're going to close the call. And if we lose, we will lose. But if I have to close your deals or play a big role, we will be a 4-person company forever. And I'd rather just go work at LinkedIn right now and shut this place down. And that worked really well. Within months, we had reps closing, Monster and AOL, large deals. And so as a founder at that time, it was more about joining and supporting them. So it wasn't being a silent participant, but never taking the wheel, sitting shotgun the entire time and simply coaching them so that I wouldn't have to be in that car within 3 months. I think that at the end of deals, there is, you'll see, actually, I do have a data point for you, Paul. On the buyer side, our data showed that there was an 81% drop off of leadership joining from first to second call. So on your buyer side, they actually do bring in the CXOs more often in a first call than a second call. So, maybe that does say you bring in your leadership up front, but I think you just got to look at the sales cycle.
Cool. Okay. Joe asks, with significantly decreased visibility in your team's day-to-day activities because everybody's remote, what's the best ways you found to measure burnout and counter it?
Yeah, Joe, what's interesting on that, the decreased part, many of us are used to walking the halls. You can feel the energy. You see everybody lined up and, our desks are 36 inches wide or 48. I remember that in my days. And that's the way you got a pulse of the team. Is it healthy? Is it fun? Is it doing it? And that clearly didn't scale. So anytime we expanded our sales teams, past 100, they're now on 2 floors, and it felt like you were going to Nebraska to go to the other floor. What I would say is that, just to counter that first point, I think that our ability to understand the experience that we're creating for customers today, the way that our teams are connecting, is higher than I've ever seen it. I haven't met many of my Chorus colleagues, yet just watching the calls and the reviews and how they engage, I have a really good sense of the day-to-day that's what's happening. On the burnout side, that is different. That is the non-work motion. And I think you pick it up, in the soft events that we're doing, right? The happy hours and the trivia events, and we had a candle making,
Whoa, that's awesome.
5 days ago. So yeah, we sent the mix, and just getting people together. We had a chef, and we were leading everybody, and they were bringing their kids and significant others in their kitchens. And that's look, we haven't cracked this code. I would welcome a ton of great ideas. This stuff is hard. I will say that this Sunday, I got invited to join our CSM team up in San Francisco, Glen Park. I just got a quick ping that the team was going to meet in the park and, distanced. And I was like, that sounds great. I'm going to bring a football and we're going to have fun. And I think I'm just so hungry for bringing the fun back to work.
I think we all are. What I've been saying is, as soon as I get vaccinated, first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to hug everybody I see, just because you miss that connection with people,
So true.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's see. Other questions. We got a bunch in here. This is from Jay. Many of the key buying journey decisions take place behind the black curtain of a customer's internal process, and the data isn't visible to an app like Chorus. How do sellers address this? In other words, you're selling to somebody, they're going to go back and talk amongst themselves. You can't really capture that data. You might be able to capture a lot of it, or we capture the data on the way out. How important are those conversations, and do they surface themselves in a way that a seller can mitigate some of those objections?
Yeah, I'd take one step back there and think about the sales world today. I mean, 99% of companies still haven't even embraced a brand new technology like conversation intelligence. We're in a massive greenfield. And so just to take a step of where the world's been, no conversations are being captured. Like the data that Tomasz, you and I are doing right now, the smiles, the head nods, none of this is being captured, these interactions. And all the world's really using today is activity data. Oh, we see that someone has a call in their books, and therefore we're going to figure out what that means. So just getting into these calls is unlocking the largest new data source to sales we've ever had. As you start to then tap into adding email signal, you're getting richer signal. As you start to tap into Zendesk and these other sources that we're getting into, it's expanding it. So we're getting much closer to that. What happens behind the scenes, I think it indirectly does show up. You see it by them bringing a CFO into a call. Why did that happen? What happened behind the scenes that made a CFO join the call, and what do we need to do differently? You see it in the emails. You see it in the delay in response times. When we lose deals, the response time is much longer. It'll go more than 4 to 5 days. When we're winning deals, there's a much faster response time between emails and interactions. All of this is data that AI can really be leveraged to spot patterns. And that's what we're doing. And every day the patterns get richer. But I think there's a lot of data here that's never been used that is transforming the industry. And that's where I look at us today.
Jim, that's a great segue about phone versus email to another question from the audience. Ken asks, are there any learnings about the effectiveness of follow-up by phone versus email? Any changes during COVID that you've seen?
Early in COVID, what surprised us was that the connect rates did not drop dramatically, a little bit. And what we were constantly hearing in some cases is that people were more accessible on their cell phones. They were home. If you had the cell number, which is readily available through many third-party solutions, people were actually answering the calls. What we did see was a massive spike in people leaving voicemails mid-COVID, and that dropped off. People aren't leaving voicemails as much today. But in general, the dials did go down, 30, 40% during certain windows there. Emails then became up. It's starting to balance out a bit more. Dials have not fully returned, but the connect rates have held steady. So that's the positive sign, is people are willing to answer the phone.
Got it. Awesome. Okay, Dominic asks, are there any changes in cold calling during COVID? This goes to like the connect rates. Have you seen any?
So significant, significant. And what we heard very quickly, companies had to redo their playbooks in a matter of days, not weeks, not months. They had to redo their entire ABM strategy. All of this was happening in April, May. You had to identify the categories that worked. But on the cold calling, I remember joining and talking to our BDR team. It's funny, you join, you want to meet the company, so I'm jumping on these Zooms, and one of the BDRs had just gotten off a call and said, "Oh, I got blown up. This person said to me, 'Are you really calling me right now?'" This is back in April.
Ouch.
"Trying to sell me something during this? Like, I'm sitting at home and scared, and you're trying to sell me, Chorus." And it shook our BDR a little bit. And my reminder to the BDR and what we were doing was that how lucky was that person to get a live phone call from us? We're a tiny team. We were 10 BDRs at the time. There's 35 million businesses out there. How lucky. I mean, it's like a stroke of lightning that this individual got a live call from a brilliant individual we had who was about to save their team, to give this person the ability to see what their team was doing and to train them so they wouldn't get fired. There's a lot of companies laying people off. We were not one of them. And we were trying to give data to leaders so that they could keep their teams and say, you know what? Our team's hustling. They're connecting. They're doing their best work. Their virtual backgrounds are great. And the reminder of the team was, we are saving careers. And even though that person might not have realized it, and they did probably have a bad day. I mean, this is scary stuff. Get back to, we can't go to everyone 10 times, but get back to them. They will buy you a beer one day and say, "Thank you. I didn't realize what you do. I maybe was in a bad mood, but you transformed our team. You saved our company. You saved our sales team." And that is why I've always chose to be in sales. We get a front row seat to the world's problems, and we get to go solve them. I mean, how cool is that? All of us on this call, we are solving the world's problems. We just got to figure out what those problems are. And if we're representing magical solutions, which I've been fortunate to do in my career, we are creating so much good for this world, but they don't always realize it on the first call. Let's know.
I love the passion, Jim. You're giving me goosebumps. I want to become a salesperson after this call. That's awesome.
I've always loved this. That's my one takeaway for those that have known me. You just need to make things happen. And that's been my career, is just finding those problems. I emailed Steve at apple.com back in 2003. I was working at Ticketmaster, and as an impromptu, Tomasz, come to work. I was living in LA, and I was like, we're Ticketmaster, they're iTunes. And so I just sent him a simple email, just a cold email. And I just said, we're Ticketmaster, your iTunes. Let's do something special together. Send. I shouldn't have even done it. That was outside of my scope. But I got a response back from his number 2 person in 24 hours, Jim Siga, saying, "We'd like to invite you up to Cupertino." And I remember, I was in my 20s, I called my boss in New York and I said, "Hey, I think I need you on this meeting."
Please.
And, by the way, a year later, it was integrated. Ticketmaster, your favorite music suddenly had all of the concert listings in it. So things happen. You just need to have passion that you are going to solve a problem. And going back to your question on the BDRs, our BDRs were getting stuck in the industry on these drips, 18 different sequences, pre-written, fill out a couple personalized notes to it. And it was getting numb. And it came off really tone deaf at the beginning of COVID. And we've seen a complete transformation of how people are engaging and being more human. And that's the authenticity that we need. This industry we're in is going to see major transformation. We have not cracked the code yet on how we engage new prospects. I'm excited for how we're going to do this better in the years to come.
Yeah. Awesome. Here's a question that we get all the time about Chorus, opportunity to address it head on. How should people think about data privacy? Are there certain segments of the market that won't allow you to record calls, or some sensitivity there? How do you think about that, Jim?
I think the world has embraced this. We're a native application inside of Zoom. And so therefore we're using Zoom's recording and their compliance techniques that are widely accepted. We've all been on recorded calls. These are customer facing calls. And we find that it's very comfortable to record these. And most importantly, it's adding value for all parties. And that's my opinion on it, but we see it day in and day out. The rep is saying, I'm really glad we recorded it because I have the perfect note taker. And literally, if they say, let me talk to my SE, our AI spots that, sends a trigger to the SE, who then calls the account right afterwards. So I think that if you're solving problems with this versus just using this as a technique to monitor, then those solutions win. And we're helping to build these brilliant relationships because the CSM knows what the AE did, and the AE knows what the BDR said, and everybody is in unison and connected. So what we find is, no, we've been attacking the enterprise and not getting any pushback on recording. We work through it, but we're highly compliant, and we take the side of doing the dual consent, which is important.
That dovetails into Rob's question from Glimpse. He says, how has the role of the pre-sales engineer in the current remote environment changed from before? Has it changed at all?
They're more accessible, so they do show up on the calls more. We've looked at this data. They're on far more calls than they were before with the AEs, mostly because they're not traveling, right? So their time, 30-minute block is much easier than having to travel out to a client. I also think they might be adding a bit more joy to the reps. You have a partner on the call. I mean, you almost do see your team. So it's a way that you're getting your team together. And then with a lot of new hires, it's a way to help make sure that the new AEs are continually learning. But we find that there's getting pulled in more and more on the pre-sale calls.
Interesting. Okay, another question about coaching. I think we got time for one or two more questions. This is another one from Paul. He says, is there any data on what distinguishes an effective coach from Chorus? Can you tell what are the behaviors between an A manager and a C manager using the data we collect?
The first thing that comes to mind is which coaches are actually using the data. And we build these manager dashboards where you can look at the engagement. So we'll look at different factors. A, are you reviewing your team's work? Secondly, are you commenting? Commenting is actually one of the most magical features in conversation intelligence. It's not something you think about right away, but the collaboration of saying, hey, that was fantastic. And we find that we looked at this, the sentiment of comments, 1/3 of them are positive in nature. So managers, 1 out of 3 times, they're very positive. They're neutral. They're not that they're negative, but oh, hey, that was great. Or it's here's a story you might want to use, or you could use on the next call. But I think the one thing is we find that top managers are in the data. They're coaching the reps. They're posting a ton of comments down to very specific moments and just collaborating. And we'll hear from our customers when they look at these reports and they see certain managers that maybe aren't doing that. It's a big tell to them on who's close to the business and growing talent and who is not.
Awesome. Okay, here's a question from Artem, which is the highest upvoted question. What parameters correlate higher with close rates? In other words, what can sales reps do in order to be more effective in closing? Have you seen anything sort of across the board that you could generalize for the audience?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that it is unique by company. So we will get into companies. I don't think it is about generalization's okay. It's about knowing your model because we're tied into your Salesforce and know what is a closed won versus a closed lost. It's about understanding what your talk tracks are. So for example, we'll work with a customer that had a lot of different SKUs, a very large group of SKUs, and a large sales team. They identified that their top performers, the ones that were closing the most business, were talking about a certain SKU that they didn't expect, that surprised them. And once they identified that SKU was what really got the prospect's interest, which was different than what the rest of the group was talking about. They replicated that success across the team. So I think it's about us identifying those patterns. Clearly, we'll look at patience and filler words and are you asking engaging questions? Those are standard. We know we need to ask 3 to 5 engaging questions and talk under 140 words per minute, which I'm not doing right now. We know that our monologue should be under a few minutes, but I don't like the generalization. I want to use the AI to understand your deals and what your patterns are to winning and then replicate that.
Yeah. Awesome. Jim, I can't thank you enough. This has been hugely insightful. I think the key takeaway for me is, particularly on the future side, I haven't heard a vision about what sales looks like post-COVID so eloquently put. That really stood out to me, that every meeting will be hybrid. And so sales teams will have an opportunity to capture more data than they ever have. And then the other thing was the emotional point of what it means to be a salesperson and how you are when you're a seller on the front lines of the world's problems, and you can help bring or alleviate some of those problems. It's such a fantastic way of describing the profession, and I know it's very much in line with Travis. He speaks about selling exactly the same way, so a lot of kinship there.
I appreciate that. Well, look, how lucky are all of us on this call to be doing what we do. We are very fortunate.
Amen to that.
As a bruised and battered and retired head of sales, just some of the concepts that you were talking about made me want to crash through the wall again and sign up for a quota. So let me know if you need some more street capacity.
Yeah, I'll ping you. Yeah. Careful what you ask for, Travis.
Yeah. Well, this is a very timely topic, as we had incredible amount of engagement here, and I think everyone, just at a human level, is excited to take the learnings from selling in COVID times, but move back to what it was like to actually engage with humans, both your teammates and your prospects and customers. So a lot of key insights and learnings, and thanks, Jim, for the willingness to be so generous with your time and your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you, Travis. Appreciate that.
Okay, so as we said, folks, we will publish some of the key learnings that came out of today's session through Tomasz's blog and the Redpoint blog. We are back at it with another office hours session. We've ramped these up now almost twice per month, given the enthusiasm from the community. And so we'll be back with you in a couple of weeks with our developer docs focused session. Ashley posted, if you can always take a moment to give us some feedback on the survey on what you'd like to see in the future from these sessions. We thrive off of that customer feedback. And thanks again for everyone's participation, engagement, and great questions. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Awesome. Thank you.